It always begins with silence. Not the peaceful kind, not the still air before dawn or the quiet that follows prayer, but a silence that feels wrong, heavy, swollen with pressure, like the universe itself is holding its breath. On the planet Desidra 9, we thought it was only another blackout, an interruption in the relay network, a solar flare, a glitch in the data lines. We were used to such inconveniences in the outer rim, so no one cared when the first long-range Vox stations went dark. No one cared when the astropaths started whispering nonsense, their eyes bleeding under the stress of a message they could not send. The sky was still blue then, and the fields still green, and that illusion was enough to blind us. The truth is that the end of a world never arrives with fire first, it comes with quiet. The kind of quiet where even your heartbeat sounds intrusive, where birds stop flying, where the wind seems to hesitate, as if afraid to disturb something enormous moving just beyond the edge of perception. In those first days, we learned what dread truly was, but we could not name it yet. From the orbiting defense bastion, the adepts reported fluctuations in the upper atmosphere, faint distortions, ion storms, gravitational ripples that did not match any stellar pattern. They called it a meteorological anomaly. The planetary governor dismissed it. The Mechanicus priests logged it and went back to their rituals. Only the psychers felt the truth pressing in, a noise beneath thought, a pulse without sound. They screamed in their sleep and clawed their faces until blood filled their mouths. They said there was something vast behind the stars, something awake and hungry, thinking thoughts that were not human. Most were executed for spreading panic. One burned himself alive in the chapel, shouting a single word that none of us understood then, the shadow. 3 nights later, the stars began to dim. Not all at once. Slowly, as if some invisible veil had been drawn across the heavens. Astronomers blamed dust, priests called it omen, and soldiers simply drank more amasec. When we looked up, the constellations we knew were faint ghosts, and between them shimmered new patterns, pulsing motes of violet light, rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat. The adepts measured electromagnetic interference spiking through every circuit. Machines stuttered, Auspex displays flickered, servitors malfunctioned, and recited prayers backward. No one admitted fear, but we all felt it. Children stopped crying. Even animals refused to move into the open. The air smelled of iron and ozone, a scent that tasted like blood before it spills. The first death happened quietly. An observator adept found lifeless at his console, mouth open, eyes wide, eardrums ruptured. There were no signs of struggle, no wounds, only the look of someone who had heard something impossible. They said his mind had been scraped clean, every neuron burned by a signal too immense for flesh to contain. After that, more psychers died, some from implosion, others from spontaneous combustion. The Shola locked their remaining adepts in lead cells, but even that could not stop the voices whispering through the walls. "It is here," one muttered before his tongue dissolved into black fluid. "The hunger is coming." By the 7th night, the silence deepened until even the wind was gone. The great manufactoria of Varan's Reach fell quiet, their chimneys no longer coughing smoke. Pilots complained that their aircraft controls grew sluggish, as if the air itself had thickened. Vox traffic turned to static. The orbital bastion stopped transmitting. That was when the governor finally authorized full planetary alert. But by then, it was far too late. The darkness was not around us anymore. It was within. I remember standing on the balcony of the barracks compound that night, staring at the horizon. There was a faint shimmer like heat haze, but it was night and freezing cold. The line of the mountains seemed to blur, ripple, and behind that motion, there was something deeper, like the suggestion of movement in ink. The stars above flickered and then vanished entirely, swallowed by a purple veil. And then, for a single heartbeat, I felt it. A consciousness vast, beyond comprehension brushing against mine, indifferent, ancient, alive. It was like standing at the edge of an ocean made of minds. I fell to my knees, vomiting blood, and when I looked up, the sky was weeping fire. The first spores descended without light. They did not blaze like meteors. They drifted, millions of them, invisible to the naked eye, carried by gravity and hunger. When dawn came, the world smelled wrong. The rain was thick, greasy, laced with black filaments that melted flesh on contact. Plants withered in hours, crops liquefied into sludge. The adept said the water was alive, microscopic organisms replicating at exponential speed, rewriting the biology of everything they touched. Cattle collapsed, their bodies convulsing as new limbs tore through skin. Farmers fled into towns only to bring contamination with them. The priests called for purification rites. The guard called for quarantine. Both were meaningless words by then. I remember the sky turning violet as sunlight struggled through the haze. The air shimmered with spores, glittering motes that drifted like snow. Children tried to catch them, laughing, before their laughter turned to screams. Within hours, hospitals overflowed. People grew fevers that boiled their eyes, or their skin split open to reveal pulsing veins that writhed on their own. Those who survived the first infection changed. Their bones softened, their eyes darkened. They stopped speaking in words, only humming a low, resonant note that vibrated the walls. We learned to fear that sound more than death itself. In the capital, the Arbites patrolled with flamers, burning streets to ash. The governor broadcast from his palace, voice trembling under the guise of authority. He said we were under biological attack, that reinforcement fleets were coming from Segmentum Solar, but the astropaths were already dead, and the Vox arrays were silent. No one could hear us beyond the clouds. The shadow had spread across the system like a suffocating blanket, swallowing every spark of the Emperor's light. Some prayed harder, others drank themselves into oblivion. The Mechanicus adepts sealed their forges and began chanting to their machine god for deliverance. But even their binary hymns faltered, metal corroding, wires dripping slime. At the 11th hour before collapse, the temperature dropped. The sun dimmed, veiled by something massive in orbit. We thought it was an eclipse, until the orbital auspex caught shape, curves too organic, patterns too deliberate. A ship, but not a ship. A Leviathan grown, not built. The images that survived show a silhouette stretching across the horizon, a cathedral of flesh and bone drifting in the void. Its surface rippled like muscle, spines flexed along its hull. Immense eyes, lidless and black, surveyed the world below as though tasting it. The adepts named it a bioconstruct. The soldiers called it what it was, a nightmare. That night, the ground began to hum, not tremble hum, as if the planet itself resonated with something unseen. From the deep earth came vibrations, patterns too regular to be natural. Instruments failed, magnetic compasses spun wildly, and even water in glasses quivered in unison. We later learned these were the resonance pulses of the hive mind, mapping the surface, scanning every heartbeat, every breath. To them, we were not enemies or souls, we were data, potential energy, meat. In the barracks, I watched as the regimental chaplain performed final benediction over the Vox. He spoke with a calm voice about duty and sacrifice, but his eyes were dead. When he finished, he turned his pistol to his temple and whispered, "The Emperor cannot hear us anymore." Then he pulled the trigger. The shot echoed for what felt like hours, because there was no other sound left in the world. Around midnight, the clouds began to pulse with light, slow, rhythmic flashes, violet and blue, illuminating silhouettes descending through the haze. They were beautiful at first, almost angelic, until they came closer. The first spores the size of aircraft struck the ground, bursting like eggs, releasing waves of mist that crawled along the streets. From within came shapes thin, multi-limbed creatures that moved with purpose, silent, swift, glistening with mucus. Our guns opened fire, and the silence finally ended. The sound of last fire and screaming merged into a single continuous roar that filled the night. I remember seeing one up close for the first time. It was not what I expected. It was not even monstrous in the way we understand monsters. It was efficient. Every limb, every plate of chitin, every joint existed only for killing. Its eyes were pits of black hunger, not anger, not malice, just pure biological intent. When it moved, it was like watching evolution made flesh, perfect and cold. We killed it with grenades, but its blood melted concrete, and the air tasted sweet and metallic afterward. We learned nothing could truly kill them, only slow them. In the command bunker, transmissions poured in from every continent, reports of contact, casualties, cities gone dark. The pattern was identical everywhere, first silence, then sporefall, then annihilation. The Mechanicus tried to calculate the swarm's biomass and failed. their instruments overloaded at numbers beyond comprehension. One Magos murmured that the mass surrounding our planet was large enough to block starlight across an entire sector. Another wept binary tears, repeating consumption probability, 100%. By dawn, the horizon glowed with fire. The invaders were no longer descending, they were growing. Structures of bone and sinew erupted from the ground, towers pulsating like hearts, tendrils stretching toward the sky. The air filled with the hum of wings. Thousands of smaller creatures formed clouds that darkened the Sunday. Our artillery fired blindly into the mist, shells vanishing into flesh that absorbed impact and reknit itself. Every time we destroyed a wave, another replaced it instantly. The sound of their approach was indescribable, a blend of rustling, wet grinding, and a low harmonic resonance that vibrated through our spines. Some soldiers went mad and tore off their helmets, clawing at their ears to escape the noise. Others simply froze, transfixed by the sight of a living tide moving like one organism, every creature guided by an intelligence vast enough to make gods seem small. We retreated to the inner walls, setting up flame traps and plasma turrets. But even as we fought, the environment itself changed. The soil softened, oozing fluid. Buildings began to sag as foundations liquefied. The planet was dying beneath our boots, its matter consumed and repurposed. I realized then that we were not merely fighting an army, we were inside a digestive system. During a brief lull, I climbed to the observation tower. The view stole the breath from my chest. The sky was no longer sky. It was a swirling storm of flesh and shadow, the great hive ship lowering veins of organic cables into the atmosphere. Lightning flashed across membranes that pulsed like lungs. And within that colossal anatomy, I could almost sense thought, cold, mathematical, infinite. We were being scanned, catalogued, absorbed. I whispered a prayer to the Emperor, but even my words felt small, trapped in the density of that silence. When the attack resumed, it came not as a charge, but as a tide rising from every direction. Streets vanished under rivers of claws and teeth. The bastion collapsed under sheer weight. Our tanks drowned in bodies that melted and fused into new shapes. The air itself seemed alive, breathing with them, and through it all, amid the screams and gunfire, there was a sound that was not sound at all, a psychic pulse that made hearts skip and vision blur, the collective voice of the swarm whispering in perfect unison. Feed. I do not remember how long the battle lasted. Hours, maybe days, time lost meaning. When consciousness returned, I was buried beneath rubble, half blind, lungs filled with ash. The sky above was black, not from smoke, but from something vast blocking the Sunday. Its surface writhed, birthing more spores that fell like snow. Around me lay the remains of my regiment. Those who still moved were no longer human. Their bodies twitched with alien rhythm, eyes glowing faintly. They turned toward me as if recognizing an intruder in their hive. I ran. Now, years later, or perhaps only hours, for I no longer trust the passage of time, I understand that silence was never absence. It was listening. The hive mind was listening to us, learning our fear, savoring the shape of our resistance before consuming it. Every whisper, every heartbeat was data. We thought we were defending a world. In truth, we were seasoning it. The silence before consumption was the universe taking note of another meal. And when the next world goes quiet, someone else will stand on a balcony beneath dimming stars and mistake that hush for peace, just as we did. They will not know that silence has weight, that it breathes, that it waits. They will not know that beyond their atmosphere, the great devourer has already opened its jaws. It began with the light fading wrong, not dimming in the usual way of clouds, but draining like someone bleeding the color out of the world. The first morning after the silence, the horizon was a bruise. The sun climbed halfway and then stalled behind a gauze of violet dust that had not been there the night before. People came out of their habs, shading their eyes, waiting for the glare to burn through, but it never did. The daylight felt heavy, sluggish, sick. When I exhaled, the mist from my breath lingered too long, as if the air were thicker, alive. I remember the static crawling across my vox bead even though it was turned off, a faint whisper that sounded like breathing through water. Somewhere above the clouds, something vast was moving. By midday, the first sporefall began. Not the meteor showers the scientists had promised, no streaks of light. No explosions, just a fine, invisible drizzle that shimmered when caught in artificial lumens. It looked almost pretty, like snow made of glass. Children held out their hands. Workers brushed it from their armor with irritation. Only later did we realize it was alive. Each particle carried code written in flesh. A seed designed to rewrite whatever it touched. The first reports came from the agribelts. Grain turning black, livestock collapsing in spasms, farmers vomiting blood that crawled away from their bodies. The governor issued a planetary quarantine, but his voice shook. The spores didn't respect lines or orders. They fell on every continent at once. The priests claimed it was divine punishment. The Mechanicus called it adaptive nanobiology, and the soldiers called it what it was, poison from the sky. We burned the crops, but the fire turned blue and refused to die. The smoke smelled sweet, nauseatingly sweet, and after breathing it, you could taste metal on your tongue for hours. Within a day, the rivers were blooming with a thin film that rippled against the current, not with it. Fish floated belly up, eyes milky, and their bodies dissolved into threads that merged with the water. At night, the surface glowed faintly like veins beneath translucent skin. We stopped drinking from the rivers, but the wells soon turned the same color. The Medicae centers overflowed. First came the coughing, then the sweating, then the voices. People said they could hear a rhythm inside their heads, a slow pulse, counting down between heartbeats. Some tore open their clothes, trying to scratch invisible insects burrowing beneath the skin. Others stood perfectly still, eyes rolled white, humming a single note that resonated through the walls. The surgeons worked until their hands shook, but every incision grew teeth. Every wound sprouted something. I saw a man's spine arch out of his back like a blooming flower. He screamed once before the petals closed over his face. We set fire to the ward, and the fire whispered as it burned. In the military compound, we watched it all through Auspex feeds until the screens turned to static. The last clear transmission showed a settlement on the western ridge. Thousands of civilians walking in procession toward the woods, slow and synchronized, as if guided by one mind. The drone operators zoomed in. Their faces were calm, mouths open, exhaling clouds of violet mist. Behind them, the trees were no longer trees. They were structures of bone and sinew twisting upward, dripping with translucent membranes that caught the weak light. The drone lost signal after that, though we could still hear the humming for several minutes, even through dead channels. Command ordered a containment strike. I was on the transport that lifted off from Varen's Reach before dawn. We flew low, skimming over fields that shimmered like oil. The pilot cursed that his instruments read 0 altitude, even though we were 200 meters above ground. The terrain itself had begun to breathe, rising and falling in slow waves. When we reached the ridge, the forest was gone. In its place sprawled a living plain of pulsing flesh, a carpet of pink and violet tissue stretching to the horizon. Our scanners failed to register boundaries. The air reeked of ammonia and decay, yet beneath it lingered a sweetness that made you want to breathe deeper against your will. We dropped promethium canisters and opened fire until the horizon turned white. For a heartbeat, the inferno roared like judgment, and then the flames bent inward, devoured by the ground. The plain quivered, absorbed the heat, and moments later, new growth erupted from the scorched soil tendrils glistening, already knitting the wound shut. We realized then the planet was no longer ours. It belonged to something that healed faster than we could destroy it. Back at base, the tech priests dissected samples retrieved by drone. Under magnification, each cell contained smaller organisms coiled inside like nested serpents, each one devouring and replacing the other in seconds. There was no nucleus, no stable DNA, only shifting logic, adaptation incarnate. "It's learning us," one Magos whispered before crushing the slide with trembling hands. "Every weapon we use becomes its next organ." They began burning their own laboratories after that. Knowledge itself had become contagious. The following week, the moons vanished, not destroyed, hidden. Their reflected light no longer reached us because the upper atmosphere was a solid veil of spore clouds. Thunderstorms raged constantly, but the lightning was green, and it struck upward, drawn toward orbit where the hive ships waited unseen. The shadow in the warp deepened. Psychers collapsed in corridors, veins bulging black. Some begged to be killed before it entered completely. Others stared at the ceiling, smiling as if listening to a lullaby. The few still coherent said the same phrase through cracked lips. The hunger is thinking. When night returned, it was absolute. No stars, no moon, only the faint violet luminescence from the living ground. Entire continents glowed like wounds. Patrols sent beyond the perimeter never came back. The motion sensors registered movement all around the fortress, but nothing appeared on visual. We heard scratching inside the walls, though the metal was 3 meters thick. The engineers blamed temperature expansion until one section buckled outward from internal pressure and a stream of black mist hissed through. The soldiers who inhaled it screamed once, then began tearing at their own armor as if it were burning them. Underneath their skin, something shifted, crawling up their throats. We shot them before it could emerge. It still wasn't fast enough. The governor broadcast again, voice distorted by interference. He said reinforcements from the Segmentum Solar were days away, that orbital strikes would cleanse the infestation. We wanted to believe him, but the last transmission from orbit had ended mid-sentence, replaced by a low droning that vibrated the stone under our feet. No one spoke of the fleet anymore. We knew the sky itself was already a lie. I tried to sleep that night. I dreamed of oceans made of mouths, endless teeth whispering prayers in binary. When I woke, the barracks ceiling was sweating. Droplets fell on my face, warm and sticky. They glowed faintly when I wiped them away. The servitors hanging in their maintenance alcoves were humming the same frequency as the psychers before they died. One by one, their eyes turned violet, and they began to laugh in perfect unison. By morning, the compound gates were submerged in fog so dense it had weight. Visibility dropped to 3 meters. Every motion detector screamed. Every Auspex needle spun wild. The perimeter mines detonated continuously, but we couldn't see what triggered them. The fog pulsed with light each time, silhouettes flickering inside, tall, thin, jointed, wrong. The sergeant ordered suppressive fire into the haze. Bolts exploded. Flames cut arcs through vapor, and for a second we thought we saw them. Creatures like insects, but not insects. Exoskeletons, glossy with slime, moving on too many legs. The moment light touched them, they melted back into shadow, leaving only the echo of movement. The fog thickened again, and the wind carried a smell of rotting copper. Someone whispered, "They're testing us." We evacuated deeper underground, sealing bulkheads as we went. The walls trembled with a rhythm like breathing. The generators sputtered. Organic residue clogged the vents. When we broke open one filter, it was packed with living tissue wrapped around the blades, still twitching. The Mechanicus priest who inspected it declared the machine infected and destroyed it with a plasma cutter. The light dimmed after that, leaving us in a gloom that flickered between blue and violet, as if the electricity itself were bleeding. Days passed, or maybe only hours. The clocks had stopped. We existed inside a womb of metal while the world above dissolved. Reports came from other bunkers. Foundations sinking, walls secreting fluids, comms reduced to static, punctuated by distant screams. Every time someone mentioned home or family, the hive seemed to notice. The lights would flicker, pressure would change, and a deep vibration would roll through the corridors like amusement. It was listening. We started whispering prayers directly into our helmets so the walls wouldn't hear. The breakthrough came without warning. A sound like tearing paper, then a fissure opening through the ceiling of the command hall. Black fluid rained down, sizzling on metal, followed by shapes. Not many at first. Scouts, small, quick, the size of men but moving like liquid. We fought them in the strobing light of alarms, the air full of acid smoke. When one died, it screamed, not in pain but in communication, and the walls responded. Veins bulged through the floor, sprouting claws. The captain detonated the charges, preset around the perimeter, collapsing the upper tunnels. The explosion threw me against the bulkhead, and I lost consciousness. When I woke, there was only silence again, but a different silence, wet, breathing, content. I crawled through debris toward daylight. The surface was unrecognizable. The city had become a forest of bone. Towers curved upward, like ribs. Streets pulsed with slow rivers of bioluminescent fluid. The air hummed, vibrating my teeth. In the distance, enormous silhouettes moved within the clouds, limbs the size of mountains, wings dripping mist. The hive fleet had arrived. Spores rained constantly now, thick as snow, piling in drifts that twitched and sank into the ground. Every living thing had merged into a single organism, a planetary skin stretching toward the sky. I realized with sudden clarity that the invasion was not something landing upon us. It was the planet itself awakening into something else, reshaped from within. As I stood there, stunned by the scale of it, the sky opened. Through the clouds descended tendrils miles wide, glowing with internal veins of light. They pierced the ground silently, connecting the surface to the heavens. The suction pulled wind, debris, even screams upward. I could feel the air thinning, molecules stolen by the feeding tubes. The tendrils pulsed faster, and with each pulse, I felt my heartbeat sink, unwillingly, to theirs. For a moment, everything around me, the humming soil, the moving sky, my own blood beat in unison. It was harmony born of annihilation. That is how the first stage ended, not with a roar, but with rhythm. The spores had done their work, the world rewritten cell by cell. All that remained was for the hive to harvest what it had grown. Somewhere beyond the clouds, the great devourer stirred, and the silence that followed was not peace. It was digestion beginning. They called it the shadow in the warp, but that name is too small for what it was. A shadow implies shape, something cast by light. What fell upon us was not absence, it was consumption. It was the universe folding inward, the fabric of thought itself thinning until nothing could pass through. We didn't notice at first. We simply felt pressure. The kind that builds behind your eyes when you try to remember a word that won't come, multiplied until your skull seems to hum with static. The psychers were the first to understand, if understand is the right word. They screamed in unison, hundreds of them across the hives, their cries overlapping through the vox before the signal collapsed into one long, endless tone. Some tried to claw the sound out of their ears. Others laughed until blood ran from their noses. Then, one by one, their hearts burst like rotten fruit. Within hours, no astropath could send or receive a single message. The Imperium's most sacred line to the Emperor, the psychic beacon that guided ships through the void, was gone. It wasn't interference. It wasn't jamming. It was erasure. Even the warp itself seemed to recoil. Pilots attempting translation into the Immaterium vanished instantly, not destroyed, just missing. The priests said the great devourer had opened its mind and the warp had looked back in terror. Maybe they were right. All I know is that prayer no longer reached anywhere. It fell out of our mouths and landed like ash at our feet. The world changed with the silence. The air itself began to feel thicker, like breathing through glass. Thoughts dulled. Dreams became alien. People started hearing whispers, not through ears, but directly inside their skulls. Tones without language, just pulse and intent. The Medici measured brainwave patterns and found identical signatures in everyone infected by the spores. We were being tuned, harmonized. The hive mind wasn't merely blocking communication. It was replacing it with its own. The effect grew stronger every hour. Even machines faltered. Cogitators that once hummed with perfect rhythm now stuttered and produced sequences of meaningless symbols, repeating fractal shapes that mirrored Tyranid DNA structures. The Mechanicus insisted it was coincidence until their own implants began broadcasting on unauthorized frequencies. One tech priest removed his data spike and wept, muttering that his augmetics had started praying to something new. They called it biocode corruption. I called it possession. When the pressure in the air peaked, the weather died. No wind, no lightning, no movement of clouds. It was as if time itself had been anesthetized. I remember walking outside the bunker and seeing ash suspended mid-fall, hanging motionless in front of my visor. Sound had weight. Even footsteps echoed too slowly. Then the colors drained again, the sky turning a bruised mauve. And from far above came a noise like a heartbeat, too vast to belong to any living thing, resonating through rock and blood alike. We thought it was thunder. It was thought. That night, the Psyker Corps, what little remained of them, were gathered in the chapel of St. Adrastia, sealed behind leaded glass and sigil wards. I was stationed outside with a squad of guardsmen, rifles ready in case the procedure failed. Through the door's viewport, I could see the Psykers kneeling, candles flickering against their shaven skulls. They were trying to re-establish contact with the Astronomicon to find any echo of the Emperor's light. For a moment it seemed to work. One of them gasped and cried that she could see terror. shining, calling them home. Then her eyes rolled white, her body levitated, and every candle in the room flared blue. The others followed, rising like marionettes pulled by invisible strings. Their mouths opened and a sound poured out. No, not a sound, a vibration that blurred the edges of reality itself. Our weapons jammed. The lead glass melted inward as if drawn by vacuum. I remember seeing their bodies twist, bones bending into sigils, flesh reconfiguring into shapes that weren't possible. Then the chapel imploded, leaving a perfect sphere of ash. None of us spoke again for hours. After that, morale collapsed. Officers stopped giving orders. Vox links only hissed. The Emperor's name became taboo because every time someone spoke it, the walls trembled. We realized the hive mind was listening through the warp itself, tasting our faith. Some guardsmen broke ranks and fled into the ruins, believing the Tyranids would ignore them if they surrendered. We never saw them again, but sometimes at night we heard them chanting outside the perimeter, in voices that weren't theirs. I spent those nights writing on ration wrappers, anything to remind myself that thoughts still belonged to me. But even handwriting changed, letters curved into spirals, sentences repeated. My dreams were no longer mine either. I saw through other eyes, vast compound eyes gazing down upon the planet, mapping thermal signatures, measuring biomass. Every heartbeat on the surface glowed like a beacon, and through that shared vision I understood. It wasn't hatred driving them. It was hunger so pure that morality couldn't touch it. To the hive mind, existence was chemistry. Planets were nutrients. We were flavor. Communication between bunkers finally ceased when the planetary relay towers liquefied. Literally liquefied. The metal softened, sagged, and ran like wax. The Mechanicus claimed the molecular lattice had forgotten how to be solid. I remember thinking that the same could happen to us at any moment. The line between matter and thought was breaking down. Days blended together. We measured time by the intervals between psychic storms. They came without warning, a sudden surge of invisible pressure that made your teeth ache and your eyes weep. Birds, what few remained, exploded mid-flight. Glass shattered. People dropped to their knees, clutching their heads. The air filled with phantom echoes, voices whispering in every direction. During one storm, Sergeant Kravik shot himself just to make it stop. The bullet barely slowed before it hit his skull. Gravity had thinned again. His body floated for a second before gently falling. The hive mind was rewriting the laws of nature, one emotion at a time. We tried countermeasures, psionic dampeners, blessed wards, even chanting litanies of negation, but they only made the resonance stronger, as if defiance drew its attention. The priests burned their relics. The tech priests cut power to everything but emergency lighting. We sat in the dark, listening to the planet breathe. Some said they could hear words forming inside that breath. Join, unite, feed. Always the same cadence, patient, inevitable. I volunteered for a recon patrol to escape the claustrophobia. Outside, the world was unrecognizable. The landscape had flattened into rippling plains of organic matter, structures half melted into bone arches, streets pulsing faintly with fluid. Every surface shimmered with translucent film that shifted away from our touch. It wasn't scenery, it was anatomy. When we stepped across it, I could feel it flex beneath my boots. One trooper vomited inside his mask. Another began to cry softly. We passed what had been a cathedral, now transformed into a mound of cartilage, from which spines jutted skyward like frozen screams. Embedded within were human faces, still intact, their mouths moving soundlessly, as if reciting prayers to a god that had already answered. The deeper we went, the weaker our minds felt. Thoughts slowed, sentences fractured. It was like walking underwater through someone else's dream. I realized that the shadow wasn't just above us, it radiated from every spore, every cell, every particle that belonged to the swarm. The hive mind had turned the planet into an extension of itself, a neuron in its galactic brain. Our individuality was interference, and the shadow was the process of erasing that noise. Halfway through the patrol, Corporal Venn froze. He was staring at the horizon, where something immense moved behind the fog. I followed his gaze and saw it, a shape so colossal it made mountains look small, stretching from earth to sky. It didn't walk, it flowed, like a tidal wave of meat and armor. For a moment, it opened what might have been a mouth, though it was everywhere at once. and a shockwave of psychic energy flattened us. Ven began to convulse. I tried to drag him back, but his skin was crawling literally, writhing with veins that detached and slithered into the soil. He looked at me and smiled, his eyes black. "It sees you," he whispered. Then he dissolved, body collapsing into steaming paste. I ran until my lungs tore. When I returned to base, I found half the garrison gone. Not dead gone. The bunkers were open, lights still flickering, meals half-eaten. Their armor lay neatly stacked, as if they had undressed and walked into the fog willingly. The surviving tech priest greeted me with a serenity that chilled me more than fear ever could. He said the hive mind had shown them unity, freedom from loneliness, and they had accepted. His voice was calm, almost loving, as he reached for my weapon. I shot him through the jaw. He didn't fall right away. His mouth kept moving, murmuring binary prayers through a hole that glowed faintly violet. I burned the body, but the ashes pulsed. After that, I stopped sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt it pulling at the edges of my consciousness, tasting memories like a curious animal. It didn't want to kill me. It wanted to understand what I meant. That was the worst part. Not the terror of death, but the seduction of dissolution. There was a strange beauty in the thought of merging, of no longer being alone inside a skull. I began to hear a second heartbeat beside my own, slow and immense, sinking closer each hour. The final transmission from command was a whisper carried through the static. "The shadow is total. The fleet will not come." Then silence again, not empty but full, humming with infinite voices just below hearing. The world no longer belonged to matter or spirit, it was thought made flesh. And that thought was hunger. I think perhaps that's what the Psychers saw before they burned. The face of a god that devours not out of malice, but necessity. A god that cannot stop eating, because to stop would be to die. I write this now from a place that might once have been a communications tower. The walls are soft, pulsing with slow rhythm. My vox clicks occasionally, not with messages, but with breath. When I speak, the echo answers a heartbeat late, repeating my words in another voice that sounds almost kind. I know the shadow has reached inside me. I feel it smoothing my thoughts, erasing edges, filling the gaps with calm. Soon I will stop writing. Soon I will understand. The hive mind does not kill, it collects. And perhaps when it finally consumes what remains of me, the silence will be complete, and I will at last be part of something vast enough to drown the memory of fear. The day the swarm descended, the sky itself seemed to fracture. Not like a storm, not like thunder or meteors, but as if reality's ceiling had cracked under the weight of something ancient pressing through. The shadow in the warp had suffocated all light for so long that we almost forgot what brightness was, so when the clouds began to glow, our first instinct was hope. We thought reinforcements had arrived, that the Emperor's fleets had broken through the psychic fog. We climbed to the watchtowers, faces pale with hunger and exhaustion, eyes squinting against that sudden, blinding white. For one heartbeat, it felt like salvation. Then the light moved. It pulsed. It breathed. It wasn't light at all. It was flame reflected through flesh. The first hive ship entered orbit in silence. We didn't hear it arrive. We felt it. Pressure built in our chests. Our teeth ached. Our blood quivered as if pulled upward by invisible strings. The clouds turned the color of bruised fruit. Something immense passed above us, blotting out the sun entirely. Instruments failed, compasses spun madly, and for a moment gravity reversed. Pebbles rose from the ground, drifting toward the heavens like tears falling upward. I remember thinking that the planet was exhaling its last breath. When the hive ship finally broke through the clouds, its scale mocked every word we had for size. It wasn't a vessel in any human sense. It was a continent turned inside out, a cathedral of flesh and bone gliding through the void. Its surface writhed with motion arteries glowing blue, titanic spines flexing, membranes fluttering as it released clouds of spores into the upper atmosphere. It didn't roar, it didn't thunder, it hummed, deep and resonant, like a heartbeat echoing through stone. Every living creature on the planet felt that pulse inside their skull. It was calling. Then the rain began again, only this time it wasn't dust or mist. It was life, falling by the millions. My visor display filled with contacts, organic masses entering atmosphere at impossible speed. each one wrapped in organic shields that peeled away like petals as they burned through. The night sky became a field of fire, trails of crimson and violet stitched across the darkness. And then they landed. The ground shook for hours. Impacts thundered across continents. Each spore pod hit with the force of an orbital strike, vomiting clouds of steam and acid. The horizon glowed red where the first cities burned. The planetary defense network opened fire macro cannons, orbital lasers, flak batteries, but it was like trying to kill a storm with stones. The sky was alive. At first, we thought they were just pods, inert biological meteors. But they were eggs, and they were hatching. The first organisms to emerge were small by Tyranid standards. Anyway, gaunts, termagants, hormagants, creatures built for speed and terror. They poured from the ruptured pods in rivers, hundreds, thousands, their carapaces gleaming in the dim light. We could hear them before we saw them, claws scraping metal, bone clicking on stone, the endless rustling of chitin against chitin. Then the first wave hit our forward lines. They didn't attack like animals. They moved like a machine with infinite limbs. Every creature knew its role, every movement part of a greater rhythm. The hormagants leapt high, pouncing through defensive fire to sow panic. The termagants followed, spitting bioplasma that melted armor and flesh alike. Behind them, larger silhouettes stalked through the mist, warriors directing the flow with psychic pulses. For everyone we killed, 10 more emerged from the pods. Their blood hissed, burning through our boots, but we kept firing because there was nothing else to do. The command channels were chaos. Screams, orders, prayers, all tangled into static. The governor's voice broke mid-sentence. Orbital support was gone. Hive ships had enveloped our satellites and were consuming them even as we fought. The defense bastions in orbit went silent within minutes, swallowed whole. I saw one through magnification as it fell. A structure miles long, coated in biomass, its once metal hull bulging as Tyranid tendrils crushed it like clay. We fell back to the inner fortifications. The air smelled of acid and ozone. The horizon burned, turning night into perpetual dawn. Civilians streamed past, faces hollow, clothes smoking from the chemical rain. Some were already infected, spore growths sprouting along their necks like tumors. We shot them because mercy had become logistics. Every bullet we fired felt like a prayer. But even prayers stopped meaning anything. The Tyranids didn't care about walls. They flowed over them. Our tanks roared through the streets, heavy bolters chewing lines of fire through the swarm. For a moment it seemed to work, bodies piling, smoke rising, but the corpses didn't stay dead. The swarm moved over itself, feeding on the fallen, breaking them down into sludge that hardened instantly into new armor, new weapons, new forms. What we destroyed became part of what we had to kill next. The battlefield itself was evolving. Then came the larger ones. Carnifexes, living siege engines. They burst from the ground like erupting volcanoes, carapace glistening with ichor, jaws splitting into triple maws. They didn't roar, they screamed, an ultrasonic wail that shattered glass and made our eardrums bleed. One charged straight through the main barricade, absorbing dozens of las bolts before plowing into a tank. It flipped the vehicle like a toy. The explosion lit up the square, and through the fire I saw the creature's shadow still moving, still feeding. The swarm adapted within minutes. Plasma burned them. They sprouted cooling vents. Flamers incinerated them. Their skin thickened, secreting gel that quenched fire. Even our blessed munitions, inscribed with holy seals, began to fail. The hive mind was watching every engagement, rewriting its own biology in real time. For every tactic we invented, it birthed an answer. I remember one scene with clarity that still haunts my dreams. A squad of guard fell back into a cathedral, the last building still standing in that district. They set up heavy bolters behind the pews, praying as they fired. The stained glass windows glowed red from the outside. The swarm came through the ceiling, hundreds at once, and within seconds the air was filled with screams. When we reached the site an hour later, there was nothing left but silence and a faint smell of incense. The walls were still covered in scripture, but the words had been rewritten in flesh. By the second day, we had lost half the planet. By the third, communication between continents had ceased. The Tyranids were no longer descending, they were emerging from beneath us. The spores that had fallen weeks earlier had germinated underground, creating nests, tunnels, hives. We were surrounded from above and below. The planet was becoming hollow, consumed from its core outward. Then the sky opened again. The second hive ship arrived, larger than the first, accompanied by a fleet of smaller biovessels. They formed patterns in orbit, like a vast nervous system connecting across the void. When their tendrils entered the atmosphere, the wind itself caught fire. We watched from the trenches as lightning danced between them, violet arcs striking the ground, and wherever the lightning hit, new organisms grew instantly, towers of bone sprouting in seconds, capped with sacs that pulsed like lungs. They were constructing infrastructure out of living matter, terraforming us into food. At this point, the Command Council ordered Operation Pyre the final fallback. Every remaining fortress was to detonate its reactors once the enemy breached. Total planetary denial. We would die, but at least deny the hive its meal. It was a noble plan, beautiful even, but the hive had already accounted for it. Their psychic field disrupted ignition sequences. Our bombs refused to arm. Our machines no longer recognized our authority. The hive mind was inside everything now. Night fell again, though the world was never dark anymore. Bioluminescent clouds drifted where the sky used to be. Rivers of light flowed across the ground as digestion pools opened, sucking in debris, flesh, soil, everything. You could see cities dissolving on the horizon, skyscrapers sinking as their metal skeletons softened. Above it all, the hive ship loomed, its underbelly glowing with the energy of 1,000 stolen suns. We fired missiles at it once. They curved mid-flight and fell back on us. In the bunker, I listened to the Vox. It was full of whispers, fragments of human speech repeating endlessly, "Hold the line, hold the line, hold the line." But the voice wasn't ours anymore. It had the tone of something learning how to sound human. I shut the Vox off and prayed. My prayer turned to laughter before I realized I was the one laughing. At dawn, if it can be called dawn when there is no sun, the final defensive line collapsed. The swarm came in waves, moving like fluid over rubble. The air shimmered with spores. Visibility was zero. I remember firing into the fog until my rifle melted. A shadow rose before me, something enormous. Wings stretched wider than buildings. It moved with impossible grace, its presence pressing against my mind until I felt myself unraveling. I tried to run, but my legs forgot how. The creature looked at me, no, through me, and in that gaze I saw galaxies burning, worlds consumed, the endless hunger of evolution itself. It wasn't evil. It wasn't even alive in the way we are. It was the universe correcting a mistake called humanity. Something exploded nearby artillery, maybe, and the creature vanished in a storm of acid rain. I crawled through the ruins until I found a crater filled with dead guardsmen. Their faces were serene. Some were smiling. In their hands they held fragments of their own flesh, molded into shapes that looked like communion wafers. I left them and kept crawling until I reached the edge of what had once been the capital. There was nothing left but a crater miles wide. In the center, the hive had begun to grow a colossal spire of bone and sinew, reaching toward orbit, pulsing in rhythm with the ships above. The feeding had truly begun. I don't know how long I lay there watching. Hours, maybe days. The distinction between waking and dreaming dissolved long ago. The ground beneath me was warm, alive, beating with the same pulse I felt in my chest. I realized the planet was now part of the hive, that every inch of it was connected. The first wave had done its job perfectly. Destroy defenses, harvest biomass, prepare digestion. We were the leftovers still breathing out of habit. When the wind changed, it carried the voices of those we'd lost, whispering in perfect harmony. The sound was beautiful, terrible, yes, but beautiful. I closed my eyes, and for a moment believed I could hear meaning in it. Not cruelty, not mockery, but inevitability. The great devourer was singing its hunger into the bones of the world, and all I could think was how peaceful it sounded, like the end of a long-forgotten song finally reaching its last note. That was the first wave. Not an attack, not even war. Just the sound of the universe eating itself, one heartbeat at a time. The devouring did not begin with a scream, but with a sigh. After the first wave, there were no more battles, no more tactics, no more orders shouted over vox static. The world had accepted what was happening, even if we hadn't. The soil no longer felt like soil. It was soft, damp, pulsing faintly, as if the planet itself had developed a heartbeat. When you pressed your ear to the ground, you could hear it slow, rhythmic, patient, like breathing. The hive was exhaling. The hive was alive. At first, we thought it was rain again. The clouds above were swollen and purple, and something wet began falling from them. But it wasn't water. It was thick, translucent fluid that steamed on contact with the ground. Where it landed, things changed. Metal turned black and bubbled like boiling skin. Concrete dissolved into mud. The bodies of the dead melted into a paste that crawled toward the nearest fissure, drawn by invisible gravity. Everything flowed, everything moved. Even the air shimmered, heavy with microscopic life. From the horizon, I watched the last mountains sink. They didn't collapse or crumble, they liquefied, sliding down their own slopes like wax. Rivers changed direction, pulled toward the feeding pools that had begun to open everywhere. At first they looked like craters, dark and bottomless, but as we got closer, we saw them move. The edges rippled with teeth. Inside churned a sea of digestive acid that bubbled and hissed, exhaling clouds of vapor that smelled like copper and blood. Anything that fell in trees, buildings, tanks, people was gone in seconds, stripped to atoms. The hive wasted nothing. Not a single molecule escaped. We tried to retreat toward higher ground, but there was no ground anymore. Everything we stepped on twitched. I saw a man sink waist, deep before realizing the field beneath him had turned into a membrane. He screamed as tendrils coiled around his legs and pulled him under. We fired into the pit until the noise stopped, but nothing bled. The ground simply closed, smooth again, as if it had swallowed a breath. The air itself became an enemy. Invisible threads drifted through its spores, so fine you could only see them when light hit at the right angle, a glittering haze that coated everything. We wore masks, but the filters clogged within hours, filling with fibrous tissue that pulsed faintly. When we cut them open, the material inside was growing. I stopped counting how many soldiers started coughing up blood that wriggled. The Mechanicus called this phase planetary digestion. It sounded clinical, almost merciful, but there was nothing mechanical about it. The hive didn't consume it repurposed. Every piece of the planet became raw material for something else. Rocks broke down into mineral veins, feeding the tendrils that reached for the sky. Water separated into hydrogen and oxygen, and was drunk by the air itself. The atmosphere thickened, tinted purple. Lightning flashed constantly now, green arcs running along the feeding cables that connected surface to orbit. You could see shapes moving within those bolts, creatures ascending in streams of light, returning to the hive ship above to be reborn. I remember the sound most of all. Not the roar of destruction, but the hum of digestion, a wet, rhythmic churning that filled every silence. At night, it was worse. You could hear bones breaking underground, millions of them at once, a symphony of cracking and grinding. Sometimes the earth would tremble, and new growths would push through. Towers of cartilage, spirals of bone, forests of tendrils waving as if in a wind only they could feel. They glowed faintly from within, veins carrying luminous fluids upward into the clouds. It was horrifying and beautiful, a nightmare rendered with the precision of art. We made camp in the ruins of an old manufactorum that hadn't yet sunk. The walls were hot to the touch, like skin fevered with infection. Every few hours, we could hear something moving inside the metal, a low creaking, as if the structure was thinking. One night, the lights flickered, and the cogitator systems came alive on their own. Lines of code appeared on the cracked monitors, repeating the same word in binaric loop: digest, digest, digest. The tech adept with us shot the console, but the word kept scrolling across the shattered glass until the screen melted. He hung himself the next morning. There were fewer of us each day. Some wandered into the fog and never returned. Others simply stopped moving, eyes glazed, lips murmuring in time with the planetary pulse. I couldn't even bury them. The ground refused the gesture. Every hole we dug filled itself again within minutes, the soil knitting together like flesh healing. I began to understand what the psychers had tried to tell us before they burned. The hive didn't just eat life, it absorbed memory, emotion, identity. Every fear we felt, every scream, every prayer became part of its pattern. It was learning the taste of humanity. I tried not to sleep, but exhaustion was stronger. My dreams were no longer mine. I saw through the eyes of the hive an endless field of neural light stretching across the galaxy, every node a world consumed. I saw how it thought, not in words but in harmonics, patterns of hunger arranged like music, and within that vast song, I could hear my planet's final note rising. We were being sung into oblivion. At dawn, the hive began to feed in earnest. The great tendrils that had descended from orbit thickened, pulsing with energy as they drank. From a distance, they looked like pillars of storm cloud, but when they passed overhead, you could see veins and nerves running through them, glowing veins carrying oceans of liquefied matter upward. They connected to the feeding pools, sucking them dry, then moved on to the next. The sky itself seemed to tilt as the planet's mass shifted. Gravity changed direction. Debris lifted and drifted toward the tendrils, consumed mid-air. It was as if the world were being peeled from its surface. By the end of that day, the horizon was gone. What had been mountains were now translucent domes of living tissue. The seas boiled away, replaced by churning pits of enzyme foam. Every living organism, plant, animal, human, had been reduced to one purpose: energy transfer. Even I could feel it, a gentle pull upward, molecules yearning to join the flow. My hair floated, my skin tingled. The hive was calling every atom home. Somewhere near the equator, the planet cracked. We felt the shockwave long before we saw it. The ground heaved, the sky screamed, and a column of light shot into orbit. The hive ship responded with an answering pulse, and the entire hemisphere lit up like dawn. Through binoculars, I saw continents folding inward, drawn into the central spire. The crust split open to reveal molten rock, which cooled instantly as it was enveloped by organic mesh. The hive had reached the planet's core. Even the mantle would not be spared. I don't remember how long I wandered after that. Days bled into nights, nights into hallucinations. Food was useless. It dissolved into slurry before reaching my stomach. Water stung my tongue like acid. My uniform fused to my skin. I thought I was the last, until I found a small group of survivors sheltering under what had once been a landing platform. There were 5 of them, gaunt and silent, eyes reflecting faint violet light. They didn't speak, only stared at me as if listening to something I couldn't hear. When I asked if they wanted to leave, they smiled in perfect unison. "Leave?" one whispered. "We are already home." I backed away and didn't stop until I collapsed. The next time I opened my eyes, the sky was gone. In its place was a ceiling of flesh, stretching horizon to horizon, glowing softly like the inside of a womb. The hive ship had lowered itself into the atmosphere, sealing the world beneath it. The temperature rose. The air smelled of iron and sweetness. I realized then that the planet was inside the creature now, or perhaps the creature was inside the planet. The distinction no longer mattered. Everything began to vibrate. The feeding tendrils retracted, their work done. The digestion pools closed, leaving behind only smooth plains of organic glass. The heartbeat quickened. Then, slowly, the world began to lift. Mountains, oceans, even the crust itself detached, rising in enormous slabs toward the belly of the hive ship. From space, I imagine it must have looked like petals closing around a flower. Within minutes, the planet's surface was gone, replaced by a sphere of glistening tissue feeding upward into the void. I expected to die then, to be dissolved like everything else. But death never came. My body refused to decay. The hive was curious, perhaps, keeping me alive as long as possible to taste every emotion, every flicker of resistance. I could feel it inside me, adjusting my heartbeat, rewriting the rhythm. The pain was indescribable, yet strangely intimate, as if the universe itself was touching me. My vision blurred, edges melting into violet haze. I heard whispers, millions of voices overlapping, harmonizing. They weren't screaming anymore, they were singing. I understood then what the devouring truly was. It wasn't destruction, it was communion. Every world the hive consumed became a note in its endless symphony. Every soul devoured became memory, data, sensation woven into the whole. It didn't erase, it integrated. It remembered us perfectly so it would never have to be us again. And within that revelation was terror and peace alike. For the first time, I didn't feel alone. When the light finally dimmed, I knew the process was complete. The planet was gone. Not even dust remained, only the lingering hum of a memory absorbed. The hive ship pulsed once, satisfied, and drifted toward the next star. I was still inside it, somewhere between matter and thought, a fragment of consciousness floating in its bloodstream. I could see through 1,000 eyes, hear 1,000 voices, taste the gravity of newborn worlds. The hunger never stopped. It was endless, beautiful, merciless. If anyone finds this recording, if anyone still listens in the dark corners of the galaxy, know this: the Great Devourer does not invade. It arrives, it feeds, it remembers. It will come for your world too, not out of hate, but out of need, because that is what life does when it becomes too perfect. It eats everything else. And when your skies turn violet and the silence begins, don't pray. There is no God left to hear you. There is only the hive, and it is already inside your blood, humming the rhythm of the end. They called it a stand, but it was really just the last shiver of a dying nerve. There was no command anymore, no real hierarchy, just instinct and duty clinging to the bones of the few who still remembered what it meant to resist. By the time the order came through the failing Vox to hold the capital at all costs, there was no capital, only a crater filled with smoke and bones. Yet we obeyed. That is what it means to be imperial. Obedience, even when obedience is madness. I remember the day the sky stopped moving. The hive ship had lowered itself so close that the clouds scraped its underbelly, and the whole horizon pulsed like a living organ. The air was thick, too thick to breathe without pain. We could hear the feeding cables drawing what was left of the atmosphere into orbit, a deep suction that made every sound vibrate. And in that choking twilight, we built our barricades from the skeletons of hab blocks and the remains of tanks. We stacked them high, layer upon layer, and behind them stood what was left of the Astra Militarum, barely 200 soldiers where once there had been millions. We had nothing left to fight for, but the act of fighting itself had become holy. The priests called it redemption by defiance. The rest of us just wanted to die loud enough to be remembered. The hive knew we were still there. It could have ignored us. We were less than insects. But perhaps it was curious, or maybe even amused by our persistence. The next wave didn't fall from the sky. It rose from the earth. The ground split open like a wound and vomited light. From the fissures came creatures we hadn't seen before, taller than buildings, carapaces thick as fortress walls. Their steps made the rubble tremble. Bioplasma dripped from their maws, sizzling holes through the barricades before they even fired. Behind them came the smaller ones in endless waves, the ground shaking with the rhythm of their advance. The sound was unbearable, a single heartbeat multiplied by thousands, synchronized to the pulse of the hive ship above. We opened fire with everything we had: lasguns, autocannons, plasma rifles stripped from dead Astartes. The night turned into day, flashes of blue and red illuminating the sea of black chitin. For a moment, for the length of a single heartbeat, it felt like we were pushing them back. Bodies fell, limbs flew, ichor hissed against the burning metal. The air stank of acid and ozone. We screamed the Emperor's name until our throats bled. Then the second line of Tyranids surged over the first. The corpses we had just killed were eaten and absorbed before our eyes, their biomass reshaped into new forms, hybrid monstrosities that bore our dead comrades' faces stretched across alien skulls. I felt something inside me break when I saw Lieutenant Mara, who had died in my arms 2 days earlier, walking toward me with her own eyes glowing violet, her mouth split into fangs. I couldn't shoot. The sergeant did it for me. The hive's psychic pressure intensified with every minute. We could feel it inside our skulls, a low, constant vibration that made teeth ache and blood throb. Men started whispering nonsense, hearing voices that weren't theirs. Some turned their guns on themselves just to silence the noise. Others dropped their weapons and began walking calmly toward the swarm, their faces serene, as if hearing a lullaby. We shot them too. There was no mercy left, only math. When the hive tyrants appeared, the battle ended in everything but formality. Each was a god of war given flesh, towering over the battlefield, wings cutting through the storm. They directed the swarm like conductors of an orchestra, their psychic commands flowing across miles of carnage. Every motion was coordinated, every death a deliberate stroke. We fired artillery until the barrels melted, but their shadows kept moving through the smoke, too large, too many. I remember one of them clearly. It landed in the plaza that had once been the heart of the capital, shattering stone and bone alike. Its talons were longer than our tanks. It looked down at us, tilting its head like a curious predator studying something fragile. Its eyes met mine, and for an instant I felt everything, the cold infinity of the hive mind, the weight of galaxies, the simple, beautiful clarity of its hunger. It was not hatred. It was purpose, distilled to perfection. The knowledge of that truth broke something inside me that will never mend. We fell back to the Basilica of St. Drusus, the last structure still recognizable as human. Its great stained windows, miraculously unbroken, glowed faintly from the fires outside. We barricaded the doors with whatever we could find: statues, debris, even the altar. There were 30 of us by then. The chaplain led us in prayer, his voice raw, half-crazed, shouting psalms that no longer made sense. Outside, the swarm gathered, surrounding us with a patient calm that was worse than fury. We could hear them breathing, thousands of lungs exhaling in unison. When they came, they didn't charge. They simply pressed forward, filling every opening, pouring through windows, doors, even cracks in the walls. We fought until the floor was slick with blood and acid. Flamers roared, bayonets flashed, and the air turned into a storm of smoke and screaming. I lost count of the bodies. I lost count of time. Every time I thought I'd killed my last enemy, another shape appeared out of the mist. They never stopped coming. At some point, the chaplain was lifted off his feet by a talon through his chest. He didn't scream. He looked upward, eyes shining, and shouted, "He sees us," before the creature tore him in half. I wanted to believe him. I still do. But when the swarm finally broke through the walls, the only thing I saw was the hive ship descending lower, blotting out what was left of the heavens. We retreated underground into the catacombs. The passageways were ancient, lined with skulls of saints long dead. We sealed the gates and set demolition charges, our last desperate plan. The sergeant held the detonator close like a relic. "If we can't save this world," he said, "we'll deny it to them." We waited. Above us, the sound of feeding filled the air like thunder in reverse. The ceiling dripped with moisture that wasn't water. Then came the psychic pulse, a wave of pressure that flattened us to the ground. The detonator blinked once and died. The explosives failed. The hive had turned even our bombs against us. One by one, the men began to lose hope. I watched as the sergeant removed his helmet and began laughing quietly. "It's beautiful," he whispered. "Can't you hear it?" I couldn't, not then. I just saw the calm on his face before he walked into the dark, leaving his rifle behind. I never saw him again. Hours later, maybe days, time had stopped meaning anything. The walls began to breathe. The skulls along the catacombs flexed, their empty sockets glowing faintly. The bones in the floor softened into cartilage. We opened fire, but bullets just sank into the living stone. I ran. I don't remember how far, only that the tunnel eventually opened into what had once been a subway chamber. The hive had claimed it, turned it into a nest of veins and tendrils. Pools of fluid glimmered in the dim light. Floating within them were the faces of everyone I'd ever known, perfectly preserved, mouths still moving in soundless prayer. I fell to my knees, shaking, gun empty. I didn't cry. There was nothing left to cry for. The hive didn't gloat, didn't mock, didn't even acknowledge me. It just continued its work, efficient and serene. Above, the rumbling of engines shook the air, the great leviathans lifting off. Satisfied. The world was finished. The feeding was done. They say the Imperium never forgets its heroes, but there would be no record of us. Our transmissions were gone, our planet erased from the star charts, our names digested like the rest. And yet, as I knelt there, surrounded by the hum of living walls, I understood something terrible and true. We had won nothing, but neither had we truly lost. We had fulfilled our design. Humanity existed to fight, to resist, to burn brightly for a moment before the dark. The hive could consume our bodies, our worlds, our memories, but the act of defiance itself left a scar, however small, on the infinite. When I finally emerged back to the surface, there was no sky, only the underside of the hive ship, vast and pulsating, a ceiling of translucent flesh through which I could see veins carrying rivers of light. The air was still. The wind was gone. All sound had narrowed to a single heartbeat, deep and slow, echoing through everything. I looked around and saw no one, no soldiers, no Tyranids, no life, just me, a speck of dust on the tongue of eternity. I raised my weapon one last time. It was cracked, its power cell dead, but it felt right in my hands. I whispered the Emperor's name, though I knew he couldn't hear me. The word left my lips and vanished into the hum. For a heartbeat, the pulse above me faltered, as if the hive itself had paused to listen. Maybe that was victory. Maybe that was enough. The hive resumed its rhythm, and the world shuddered one final time. I closed my eyes and imagined the stars beyond the veil, the forgotten constellations of a galaxy still burning. I thought of every guardsman who had ever stood their ground, knowing it would change nothing, and I smiled. In the end, defiance is the only prayer that matters. The last thing I felt was warmth, spreading up my legs, across my chest, into my lungs. The hive was drinking again, and I was the cup. I took a breath that wasn't mine and let it out slowly. The sound that came with it was not a scream, but a sigh. And for the first time since the silence began, I felt peace. When I woke, there was no sky, no ground, only the color of bone. The world had stopped moving. Time had lost its heartbeat. For a long moment, I believed I was dead, that my soul had drifted into some pale limbo beyond the Emperor's light. Then I felt the air shiver, faint and warm, against my skin, the breath of something vast, still alive. The hive had finished feeding. Now it was digesting. I rose, unsteady, surrounded by silence, so absolute it rang in my ears. What had once been the capital was now a flat plain of ivory glass, stretching beyond sight. No ruins, no ash, no shape left to remember what had been. The earth was smooth and curved, faintly translucent. Beneath it, I could see veins of dim blue light pulsing slowly like buried arteries. The hive's work was perfect. It had stripped everything unnecessary, the chaos of individuality, the noise of history, leaving only purity of function. This was not destruction. It was refinement. I began to walk. My boots left no print. The surface yielded slightly, like skin, and each step released a faint vibration that echoed back through my bones. There was a rhythm to it, a lingering pulse, as though the planet itself was breathing through me. Far away, the remains of the hive ship still hovered, enormous and silent, its tendrils withdrawn. It looked almost serene now, no longer monstrous, a mother sleeping after feeding her children. As I moved, I found objects half buried beneath the glass. A helmet fused into the surface, a melted lasgun, a handful of bones so white they were almost luminous. They had been stripped clean, the marrow gone, the memories gone. I knelt beside them and whispered the names of the fallen, though I knew the words meant nothing. Sound died in this place as quickly as thought. Even my voice came back hollow, thinner each time I spoke. On the horizon, faint shapes rose and fell, towers of bone swaying like trees in wind that no longer existed. Their surfaces shimmered with the remnants of light drawn from our sun before it died behind the hive. I walked toward them, craving movement, craving anything that wasn't silence. It took hours, or maybe only minutes. Time was a rumor here before I reached them. Up close they were immense, each the height of a fortress, but soft to the touch, porous like coral. When I pressed my hand against one, it quivered gently, and an echo shuddered through the ground beneath me. The echo carried voices. At first they were indistinct, like distant wind. Then they became clearer, whispers overlapping, familiar tones woven together. I recognized them all, my squad mates, the chaplain, even the governor's trembling diction, each repeating fragments of prayer, laughter, fear. Their words weren't separate anymore. They rose and fell in unison, perfectly harmonized. The hive had kept them, not as individuals, but as resonance. Their essence had been absorbed into the tissue of the world, their memories converted to song. I wanted to scream, but my throat refused. A strange calm settled over me, heavy and sweet. There was beauty in it, a terrible symmetry. The hive hadn't murdered them. It had transformed them into something enduring, something eternal. They would never rot, never fade, never be forgotten, because forgetting itself no longer existed. The hive remembered everything. I wandered for what felt like days through that endless field of skeletal monoliths. Each hummed with a slightly different tone, together forming a chorus that never stopped. Sometimes, when I closed my eyes, I could hear words in their music, not spoken, but understood. We are one. We are peace. We are hunger still. The sky above was no longer black or violet. It was pale grey, streaked with faint auroras, reflections of the hive ship's interior still pulsing as it processed the remains of the world. Occasionally, a fragment of light would fall from it, not flame, not metal, but droplets of luminescent fluid that drifted down slowly and sank into the ground without sound. Each drop left behind a ripple of warmth that spread under my feet. The planet was still alive, still connected, still dreaming in its sleep. Eventually, I reached the sea, or what had once been the sea. Now it was a mirror of frozen enzyme, smooth and white, stretching to the horizon. The surface was solid, but below it I could see movement, shapes swimming lazily through the translucent depth, remnants of what the hive had left behind to finish its work. Great serpentine forms gliding through liquid glass, their bodies trailing streams of light. I stood on the shore and felt the vibration of their passage. There was no fear left in me, only awe. I think that was when I began to understand the meaning of the hive's silence. It wasn't absence, it was fulfillment. The universe had no need to speak once it had achieved perfect harmony. The hive didn't roar, didn't rage. It simply existed, a thought too complete for language. I realized then that my heartbeat had matched its rhythm without my noticing. Each breath I took was slower, deeper, more deliberate, sinking with the pulse beneath my feet. I don't know when the first of them appeared. I was kneeling by the shore, tracing circles in the glass, when shadows fell across me. They weren't Tyranids as I had known them. These were smaller, fragile, almost human in outline constructs of pale chitin and luminous flesh. Their faces were smooth, without eyes or mouths. They moved with a grace that felt ceremonial rather than predatory. When they stopped before me, the air hummed with pressure. One reached out a hand long, thin, jointed, wrong but gentle. I should have run. Instead, I extended mine. Our fingers touched. A flood of images tore through me. Not memories, not thoughts, but impressions. Stars collapsing, galaxies feeding, the slow migration of hunger across eternity. I saw countless worlds die just as mine had, each feeding the next, each note in the endless symphony of consumption. But within that, horror was order. Every death gave birth to life somewhere else. Every silence echoed into new creation. The hive wasn't ending the universe, it was recycling it. The thought was too vast to hold. But for an instant I grasped it, and it felt almost divine. When the vision faded, the constructs were gone. Only the impression of their touch remained, a faint warmth spreading through my veins, pulsing in time with the earth. I realized then that I was changing. My reflection in the glass surface no longer matched memory. My eyes glowed faintly, not with light, but with awareness. My skin shimmered in places where it caught the dim glow. I wasn't afraid. I knew what was happening. The hive had decided to keep me, as it had kept everything else. I don't know how long I lived in that half-world afterward. Perhaps years, perhaps moments. There was no hunger, no thirst, no pain. I walked the plains and spoke to the voices beneath the glass. Sometimes I thought I heard laughter. Sometimes, the echo of my own voice answering me from far away. The hive ship remained overhead, smaller each day as it drifted toward the void, leaving its work behind. I imagined it looking down at me, a mother proud of her last fragment before moving on. One night, if nights could still exist here, the auroras faded. The ground grew still. For the first time since the invasion began, the pulse stopped. I fell to my knees, dizzy, as silence, true silence, settled over the world. It was unbearable. The absence of that rhythm felt like losing a limb. I realized I had grown dependent on it, that my heart had been borrowing its beat from the hive. Without it, I felt hollow, alone. I screamed then, for the first time in years, a raw and desperate sound that echoed into the grey air. There was no answer. The hive had gone. Its attention moved elsewhere, and I was nothing but residue left behind, a ghost walking the skin of a dead god. I looked at my reflection one last time and saw that my face was no longer human. The transformation was complete. I was one of its memories, a living echo, a fragment of something far greater. When I stood again, the world shimmered faintly, as if acknowledging me. The glass beneath my feet glowed briefly, pulsing once before fading. I understood. The hive had not abandoned me. It had simply stored me here, embedded within its archive. I was the witness, the storyteller, the last neuron firing in the brain of a world that no longer existed. So I speak now, or write, though there is no one left to read. The words are for the stars, perhaps, for any who might drift close enough to hear the whisper of this husk. If you do, remember, this is what the end looks like. It isn't fire or chaos or judgment. It's order, it's quiet, it's peace built from bones and memory. The great devourer doesn't hate. It only fulfills the oldest law of creation, to consume and be consumed. I will remain here until the surface cools, until the last flicker of warmth fades beneath the glass. Then my voice will join the others in the song below. And maybe, somewhere far across the void, another world will listen and shudder as its sky begins to dim. That is the way of things. The hunger moves on, patient as gravity, inevitable as night. When it returns, and it will remember my words. When the silence comes, don't fight it, don't pray, simply listen. Because in that silence, you will hear everything that ever was, and everything that will be. The sound of creation unmaking itself so it can begin again. That is the gift of the hive. That is the aftermath. I have stopped counting time. The sun is gone, the hive ship gone, and still the world glows faintly from within, like an ember refusing to die. Sometimes I think I hear the pulse again, distant, fading, echoing across the void. Sometimes I think it is only memory. Either way, it no longer matters. The hive has moved on to new stars, new worlds, new voices to add to its choir. But its song remains inside me, humming low beneath every thought, the rhythm of something that can never end. The eternal hunger is not an enemy. It is not a curse. It is the breath of the universe drawn in before exhaling creation again. I know this now because I can feel it inside everything, even the dust drifting across this hollow plain. Hunger is life pretending to be purpose. The hive only made it honest. When I close my eyes, I see them, the worlds it has touched, shining briefly before dissolving into the tide. Each one thought itself unique, irreplaceable, chosen. Each cried for deliverance when the sky dimmed. None were spared. And yet, in the instant before they vanished, each left behind a note, a frequency, a memory, a flavor, and the hive remembered. It carries them all, every voice, every prayer, every scream, folding them into its endless harmony. We called it extinction. It calls it communion. I used to believe the Emperor watched over mankind. Now I understand the truth. No god can hear forever. Even divinity has limits when faced with appetite the size of galaxies. Perhaps he too will be devoured one day, and perhaps in that consumption, he will finally be understood. The hive does not blaspheme. It equalizes. It erases the distance between creation and consumption, between the holy and the profane. It turns faith into nourishment and then into memory. In that cycle, there is no evil, only function. When I wander the glass plains now, the air trembles around me with faint harmonics. The bones beneath the surface still whisper. They are not lamenting, they are dreaming. I can feel them stirring as the world cools, preparing for the next phase of transformation. The planet is becoming something else lighter, smoother, crystalline. Soon it will drift free from gravity, a shell of memory floating through the void. Another seed to be scattered, another echo in the swarm's mind. Sometimes I wonder if any of us truly died. Perhaps the hive simply rearranged us. I feel them still, my comrades, my enemies, even the civilians who screamed as the sky fell. Their presence surrounds me like warm static, too vast to separate into individuals. When I speak aloud, the wind answers in their voices. When I sleep, I dream through their eyes. I am not one man anymore. I am the sum of everything that was consumed. I am the taste of this world preserved in the hive's memory. I remember a time when I feared that idea. Now it comforts me. To be part of something so vast, so complete, is to be freed from the burden of choice. There is no sin in hunger, only inevitability. Life feeds, always. The difference between us and the hive was never moral. It was scale. We killed to survive, to expand, to feel safe. The hive simply perfected that instinct until it became the language of stars. From here, I can see the void beyond the thinning clouds. Distant suns glimmer faintly, and somewhere among them, another world is hearing its first whispers in the warp. They will call it anomaly, plague, omen. They will send fleets, prayers, armies. They will fight as we did, and they will fall as we did. And one day, their survivors will stand where I stand now, staring into silence and understanding that the silence is love, the only kind the universe can afford. I sometimes think of the moment when the first human discovered fire. How terrified they must have been, seeing light consume the world and yet give warmth. How quickly they learned that to live, one must burn. The hive is that fire on a cosmic scale. It burns worlds to keep existence alive. Without it, entropy would win. Without hunger, even stars would forget to shine. The hive remembers so that the universe can continue. When the last heat leaves this world, I will walk into the sea of glass and lie down. The surface will accept me. It always does. My reflection will vanish, my thoughts will scatter, and I will join the song beneath. Perhaps, when the great devourer passes near this husk again, it will feel that faint vibration and recognize me. Perhaps it will pause, for the smallest instant, to remember this place, the world that sang before it was swallowed. If anyone ever finds this message, drifting among the ruins of what we called the Imperium, know this: the end is not coming. It has already come, and it was beautiful. It was the sound of a godless universe, finding meaning in the only way it could, through hunger, through transformation, through the endless cycle of consumption and rebirth. We were not victims. We were ingredients. I once thought the hive erased individuality. Now I understand it preserves it in the only way permanence allows as part of the whole. Every thought I have will become pattern. Every breath I take becomes another heartbeat in the swarm's chest. I am immortal, not because I endure, but because I am forgetfully eternal. The wind rises, dust lifts from the glass, spiraling upward in thin columns that glitter faintly before fading. I realize it is not wind at all, but the last breath of the planet leaving its shell. Soon the core will cool completely, and this place will drift among the stars like a pearl. I kneel and place my hand on the surface. It is cold now, truly cold. The pulse is gone. Yet beneath that stillness, I feel something vast and distant. The faint rhythm of the hive moving between galaxies, endless, unstoppable. That rhythm is life. That rhythm is death. That rhythm is forever. I smile, because I finally understand the story we were part of. The Imperium believed itself eternal, built on faith and steel. But eternity does not belong to monuments or gods. It belongs to hunger. The hive is the truest expression of life because it cannot die. It is the sum of all things that ever were, feeding itself so it may continue to dream. And in its dreaming, every world lives again. I look to the horizon one last time. The light of a distant sun glints off the dead ocean. For an instant, it looks like dawn. I know it isn't, but I let myself pretend. I whisper a final prayer, not to the Emperor, not to salvation, but to the hunger itself. Remember us, I say. Remember that we fought. Remember that we burned bright before the quiet came. The glass beneath my feet cracks softly. A thin beam of blue light rises from the fissure, climbing toward the stars. It pulses once, twice, in perfect rhythm with my fading heart. The hive is listening. The hive remembers. The hive is already on its way to the next feast. And as the light consumes me, I feel no fear, only gratitude. Because now I see the truth behind all creation. Everything that lives must eat. Everything that eats must die. And everything that dies must feed the next beginning. That is eternity. That is the great devourer. That is the endless, merciful hunger that binds the stars together. I fade with it, thought dissolving into warmth, self into chorus. The silence that follows is not death. It is completion. The hive moves on,